people tend to talk about death as if it's a wall, something solid, final, and absolute. But I've always found it a bit curious. Yeah, because in science, we rarely trust things that look like ends. Most of the time, what we call an ending is just a transformation we don't yet fully understand. Nothing in the universe really disappears. Energy doesn't vanish. Matter doesn't simply stop existing. It changes form, rearranges itself, becomes something new. So it raises an interesting question. If everything we observe follows this pattern, why should light be the one exception? Now, I'm not here to claim I have the answer. The more you learn, the more comfortable you get with not knowing. But that's exactly what makes this topic so fascinating. But treating death as a closed door. Maybe we should look at it the way a curious scientist would, as a mystery, an open question. Something worth exploring rather than fearing. So today, I want to take you on that journey. Not to prove that death isn't the end, but to wonder, to question, and maybe to see it from a perspective that's a little less certain, but more interesting. You know, people tend to talk about death as if it's a wall, something solid, final, and absolute, a full stop at the end of a sentence that we never get to finish reading. But I've always found it a bit curious, because in science, we're actually very suspicious of things that look like ends. When something appears final, we usually take a closer look, because more often than not, it turns out to be something else entirely. A transition, a shift, a change in form that we didn't immediately recognize. If you think about the natural world, nothing really just stops. Energy doesn't disappear into nothingness. It transforms, it doesn't simply vanish. It rearranges itself into new patterns. The atoms that make up your body right now were once part of stars, ancient oceans, plants, and countless other living things. Been recycled, reused, and restructured over billions of years, constantly participating in this grand, ongoing process. So when we say something has ended, what we usually mean is that it has changed into something unfamiliar to us. And that's where it gets interesting. Everything we observe in the universe follows this principle, this continuous transformation. Then it raises a rather uncomfortable but fascinating question. Why do we assume that life is the exception? We conclude that consciousness, experience, or whatever it is that makes us us simply comes to a complete and absolute halt. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't. The honest answer is we don't fully know. And that's an important part of this discussion. In science, admitting uncertainty isn't a weakness. It's actually where the real exploration begins. The moment you say, I don't know, you open the door to curiosity, asking better questions instead of settling for easy answers. It's also worth noticing how much of our fear comes from that uncertainty. We tend to imagine death as this dark, empty void, mainly because we can't observe it directly. But throughout history, there have been many things we once considered mysterious or even frightening, simply because we lacked the tools or understanding to explain them. And used to be seen as something almost supernatural. Now we understand it as a natural electrical phenomenon. The mystery didn't disappear. It evolved into knowledge. Maybe the way we think about death says more about the limits of our perspective than about death itself. We are creatures that experience the world through our senses, our memories, and our expectations. Something falls outside of that framework. We label it as the end, not necessarily because it is, but because we don't yet have a better way to describe it. But there's something strangely exciting about that. Viewing death as a closed door, we could look at it the way a curious mind approaches any unknown, not with blind belief, and not with immediate fear, but with a sense of wonder. Rather than being an absolute ending, it's simply a part of a much larger process that we are only beginning to glimpse. Because when you really think about it, the habit of being far more creative, far more surprising, and far less final than we expect. There's also something else that makes this whole idea worth thinking about. And it has to do with how we define existence in the first place. Because when we say something exists, what do we really mean? Do we mean that we can see it, touch it, measure it, or do we mean that it has some kind of effect, some kind of presence, even if we don't fully understand its nature? Take something like a wave in the ocean. Picture a wave. If you focus on one particular wave, you might give it an identity. You might say that wave is there and now it's gone. But what actually disappeared? The water didn't vanish. The energy didn't vanish. What changed was the shape, the pattern, the form that briefly appeared and then dissolved back into the larger system. The wave was never truly separate from the ocean. It was just a temporary expression of it. And maybe life is a little like that. Maybe what we call a person with thoughts, memories, emotions is a kind of pattern, a very complex and beautiful arrangement of matter and energy that exists for a while and then changes. From perspective, death isn't so much a destruction as it is a transformation of the pattern into something else, something we don't yet recognize or know how to describe. That raises more questions than it answers. What happens to the pattern of consciousness that can persist in any meaningful way? Or is it entirely dependent on the physical structure of the brain? These are not easy questions, and they're not ones we can settle with simple explanations. But that's exactly what makes them interesting. That we don't have clear answers means there's still room to explore, to think, to imagine possibilities without immediately closing the door. And it's also interesting how much of our understanding is shaped by scale. At the human level, things feel very personal and very finite. We experience and the endings all the time. A day ends, a conversation ends, a life ends. But when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, those endings start to look different. Parts of cycles, parts of ongoing processes that don't really have a clear start or finish. Stars, for example, are born. They born and they eventually collapse or explode. The death is also what creates the elements that make planets and eventually life. So what looks like an ending at one level becomes a beginning at another. The universe seems to recycle itself in ways that are both elegant and, in a sense, continuous. The difficulty isn't that death is truly the end, but that we're trying to understand it from too narrow a point of view. Where you used to thinking in terms of individual experiences, individual lifetimes, and individual identities. And within that frame, death does look final. It looks like everything we know simply stops. If we shift the frame even slightly, it starts to look less like a full stop and more like a comma, a pause in a much larger sentence that we're only able to read a small part of. Something deeply human about wanting certainty here. We want a clear answer. Either it's the end or it isn't. But nature doesn't always work in such clean, simple categories. Often the truth is more subtle, more complex, and sometimes a bit uncomfortable because it refuses to fit neatly into our expectations. So instead of rushing to define death as either complete nothingness or something else entirely, it might be more honest and more interesting to sit with the question itself. Recognize that what we call the end might just be a limitation of how we see things, rather than a definitive statement about reality. Another way to look at this is to think about information, not in the everyday sense of facts and figures, but in the deeper scientific sense of patterns that describe how things are arranged. Every living thing, including you, is made up of an incredibly detailed structure of information. Your memories, your habits, your voice, even the way you think are all tied to this intricate organization of matter and energy. It's in physics that has thrown idea. Still, there's a strong idea still debated and explored that information itself isn't easily destroyed. It can be scrambled, transformed, hidden in ways that are almost impossible to recapture. But the fundamental patterns don't just vanish without a trace. This idea shows up in discussions about black holes, quantum mechanics, and the nature of reality itself. So if the universe tends to preserve information in some form, it leads to a rather curious question about us. What happens to the information that makes you you? At a glance, it seems obvious. The brain stops functioning, the structure breaks down, and everything that depended on it simply ends. At a level we can observe directly. That's true. Your organized system that maintained your thoughts and awareness no longer operates in the same way. Connect and think in terms of information rather than just physical activity. The picture becomes less clear because even when a system breaks apart, the components don't disappear. The particles remain, the energy remains, and the interactions they have leave traces in the world around them. Every conversation you've ever had, every action you've taken has influenced other systems, other people, other processes in ways that continue forward, which is some parts of your pattern are constantly being distributed, woven into the larger fabric of reality. It's a bit like lighting a candle in a dark room. Until we eventually go out, but the light it produced didn't just stay in one place. It spread, it interacted, it changed the environment, and even though you can gather that exact light back together again, it still had real, lasting effects. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that consciousness continues in a way we would recognize what they need some kind of personal awareness after death. But it does challenge the simple idea of complete disappearance. Just that what we are is not as isolated or self-contained as we often assume. Instead, we are deeply connected. To everything around us. Constantly exchanging energy and information with the world. And that makes the idea of an absolute ending a little harder to pin down. Because if the boundaries between you and the rest of the universe are all already somewhat blurred during life, then what exactly is it that ends? The specific arrangement, the ongoing process, the sense of identity, our ability to observe and describe it. These are subtle distinctions, but they matter. They shift the conversation away from a simple yes or no answer and toward a more nuanced way of thinking, of asking whether death is the end. We start asking what kind of end it might be. An ending of form, of function, of experience, but perhaps not an ending of everything that contributed to it. The more you think about it, the more it seems that nature doesn't really favor absolute endings. It favors continuity, transformation, and the redistribution of structure into new forms. Forms are very different from what came before. There is also a psychological side to all of this that's just as interesting as the physics. But that shapes how we experience life. If you're convinced that everything ends completely and absolutely, it can make life feel fragile, almost like something that's constantly on the verge of slipping away. And on the other hand, if you assume there's some kind of continuation, some kind of persistence beyond what we can see, it changes the way you interpret your place in the world.
But what's fascinating is that in both cases, we are still dealing with stories, mental models we construct to make sense of something we can't directly observe.
The human brain is very good at filling in gaps. When faced with uncertainty, it doesn't like to stay in that uncomfortable space for very long. So it reaches for explanations, even if they're incomplete. For an answer over an open question, even when the open question might actually be closer to the truth. And that tendency shows up everywhere, not just in how we think of death. Death, we like clear-cut, sharp boundaries, and simple conclusions. Either exists or it doesn't. Something either continues or it stops. But when you look closely at how the universe actually behaves, those clean divisions start to blur. Oval of arc, transform, and sometimes exist in states that don't fit neatly into our usual definitions. So maybe part of the challenge here isn't just understanding death, but recognizing the limits of the way we think. The language, our concepts, even our intuitions are shaped by everyday experience, by things we can see and touch and measure directly. Death, or death, whatever it is, seems to sit right at the edge of that experience. It's not something we can step outside of and examine in the usual way. That people often turn to philosophy, religion, or science for answers, each offering a different kind of framework. Science tries to describe what can be observed and tested. Philosophy explores the meaning and implications of those observations. Religion often provides narratives that give emotional and moral structure to the unknown. And while these approaches sometimes seem to conflict, they're all, in a way, attempts to deal with the same fundamental mystery. What's interesting is that none of them on their own fully close the question. Science can tell us what happens to the body, but it doesn't yet fully explain consciousness. Which it can question and analyze, but it doesn't always provide definitive answers. Religion can offer certainty, but that certainty often depends on belief rather than direct evidence. That in this space where multiple perspectives exist, each capturing part of the picture, but not the whole thing. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe that's exactly how it's supposed to be. The universe were simple enough to be completely understood in a straightforward way. It probably wouldn't be as rich or as interesting as it is. The fact that there are still unanswered questions, especially about something as profound as death, suggests that there's still more to learn, more to explore, and more to think about. Again, that seeing uncertainty as something negative, we might start to see it as an opportunity. Not knowing doesn't mean there's nothing there. It just means we haven't figured it out yet. And throughout history, that's been the starting point for some of the most important discoveries we've ever made. And when you begin to look at death through that lens, it becomes less of a fixed conclusion and more of an open problem, something that invites curiosity instead of shutting it down.